My sister moved into my apartment and threw out all my clothes. Mom yelled, "You always were the selfish one, Lisa." So I stood there, staring at the empty closet. Then I picked up my old diary and made one call. "You threw out all my clothes?" Brianna rolled her eyes like I was being dramatic. "Come on, Lisa. Your stuff was so outdated. I was helping you." "Without asking me?" I said, my voice cracking. "God, you're so uptight," she said. When I called Mom, desperate for support, she only barked, "You always were the selfish one, Lisa." That was the moment I realized something: they were never going to be on my side. And maybe I didn't need them anymore. Growing up in Charleston, I was used to humidity, tourists clogging the streets, and pretending everything was just fine for appearance's sake. That's what the Whitmore family did. My parents, Marjorie and Glenn, were the kind of people who smiled tight-lipped at church functions but waged cold wars at home. I was the firstborn, the one who made honor roll, followed rules, kept secrets. Brianna came 9 years later and blew up the family dynamic like a tornado. She was messy and brilliant and chaotic, and from the moment she was born, it was clear, her needs eclipsed mine. Still, I tried. I spent years contorting myself into what they needed: the responsible one, the caretaker, the rock. By 38, I had carved out a small, peaceful life. My own place, a tiny apartment with peeling brick walls downtown. A job I didn't hate. A few houseplants that somehow stayed alive. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Then Brianna called. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. Something about her boyfriend Neil kicking her out. No money. No job. No options. I hesitated. I really hesitated. But I thought about how alone she must feel. I thought about what Mom would say if I refused. "Just for a few weeks," I agreed. "Until you get back on your feet." At first, it was fine. She crashed on my couch, disappearing most days to look for work or paint. I didn't ask too many questions. I cooked for her. I did her laundry. I gave her space. I tried to be the good sister. But Brianna had a way of filling up every inch of a room, every second of your day, until there was no air left for yourself. One evening, I came home to find she had redecorated. My living room looked like a bohemian fever dream. My grandmother's old side table, the one thing I had kept from the house I grew up in, was shoved into a closet. My beige couch had been draped with colorful, garish fabrics. Candles flickered dangerously close to old curtains. When I protested, she laughed. "Lisa, your place was a tomb. I'm giving it life." I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. I swallowed my anger. The next week, my bathroom turned into her personal spa. Half my toiletries disappeared. Her friends started showing up, loud and uninvited, trailing cigarette smoke and muddy boots. Still, I gritted my teeth. "Just a few more weeks," I repeated like a prayer. Then came the night that broke everything. It had rained all day. I was soaked, miserable, exhausted. I wanted nothing more than to peel off my wet clothes, slip into my flannel pajamas, and burrow under my quilt. I opened my closet. It was empty. At first, I thought maybe there had been some kind of leak. Maybe she had moved my things to protect them. But no, the closet was bone dry. No pants. No dresses. No sweaters. No shoes. My work blouses. My winter coat. Even the ratty old hoodie I wore when I was sick. Gone. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs. "Brianna!" I shouted, panic and rage bubbling up in my chest. She appeared in the hallway, paint smudged across her cheek, holding a dripping brush. She looked like I had just woken her from a dream. "What's up?" she asked, all innocent. "My clothes," I managed to say. "Where are my clothes?" She blinked, then gave a careless little shrug. "Oh, that. I took them to Goodwill." I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. You needed a fresh start anyway, she said lightly. They were so sad. I'm doing you a favor. A favor. I grabbed my phone and, without thinking, called Mom. I needed someone, anyone, to tell me this was insane, that I wasn't crazy for being furious. Mom picked up on the second ring. Before I could even explain, she cut me off. You always were the selfish one, Lisa, she snapped. Poor Brianna has nothing, and you're crying over a few outfits? Honestly, I don't know why you can't just be supportive for once in your life. It was like someone had reached into my chest and twisted hard. I hung up without saying goodbye. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty closet, feeling small and stupid. Feeling like I was 9 years old again, being blamed for things I didn't do while Brianna cried her way out of trouble. Then my eyes fell on the battered old diary tucked into a milk crate under my bed, the one I had kept in college, back when I still believed in things like fairness and second chances. I pulled it out with shaking hands. Flipping through the pages, I found what I was looking for, a phone number scrawled in messy blue ink. Mr. Wallace. My old landlord. A gruff, no-nonsense man who once told me, if you ever need a place fast, you call me. My fingers trembled as I dialed. He answered on the third ring. Lisa Whitmore, he barked. Been a long time. You okay? No, I said, surprising myself with the honesty in my voice. I need a place. Tonight, if possible. He didn't ask questions. He just said, come by the office. I'll fix you up. I packed what little I had left. Some dry cleaning I hadn't picked up yet. A toothbrush. My laptop. I took my grandmother's side table from the closet. I left a note on the kitchen counter, written in careful block letters, this is what selfish looks like. Enjoy. I locked the door behind me and didn't look back. The new apartment was nothing like my old one. It was a tiny studio above a bakery on King Street, with walls so thin I could hear the downstairs oven timer buzzing every morning at 5 a.m. The ceiling sloped like an attic, the linoleum floors were cracked, and the only furniture was a rickety bed frame and a dented mini fridge. But when I dropped my suitcase on the floor and heard the satisfying thud of something mine touching the ground, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. The landlord, Mr. Wallace, had even handed me a second-hand keychain in the shape of a tiny house when I signed the lease. Start fresh, kid, he said gruffly, clapping me on the shoulder. I didn't tell him how much those two words meant to me. I slept that first night under a borrowed quilt, listening to the soft hum of the city below and the sweet smell of baking bread seeping through the floorboards. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And nobody could take it from me. The next morning, I walked to the thrift store 2 blocks over and picked up a few essentials, a chipped coffee mug, a couple of plates, a second-hand jacket that didn't quite fit but kept me warm enough. I texted my boss to let him know I'd be working from home for a few days, I couldn't face the world just yet. By the third day, I started to feel almost peaceful. Of course, peace didn't last long. The first text came from Mom, when are you coming to your senses? Brianna said you stormed off and left her with nothing. I didn't reply. An hour later, another one, we are a family, Lisa. Families work through things. Then Brianna herself, sis, can we just talk? I didn't mean to upset you. You're so sensitive. I tossed my phone onto the bed and left it buzzing. I refused to be guilt back into chaos. Instead, I started building something new, one small habit at a time. I found a tiny used bookstore run by an old man named Mr. Delacroix, who wore tweed jackets even in the heat. I started spending Saturday mornings browsing shelves, losing myself in stories that didn't involve betrayal or manipulation. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center 2 nights a week, even though my first few creations looked like wobbly ashtrays. I cooked simple meals for myself, pasta with butter and garlic, grilled cheese sandwiches, chicken soup from scratch. Meals that tasted like care. Slowly, the knot in my chest loosened. But just as I started to feel like I could breathe again, the real backlash began. First it was the mutual acquaintances, old family friends, church ladies, neighbors who had known me since I was a little girl. I ran into Mrs. Henley at the grocery store, and she gave me a tight, judgmental smile. "Heard you're going through a phase," she said, clucking her tongue. "Abandoning your poor mother and sister like that. Shame." I stared at her, the can of soup slipping slightly in my hand. It wasn't worth explaining. They had already picked a side. Next came the phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I stopped answering after the first few. The voicemails blurred together. "Lisa, we're worried about you. Family is everything. Brianna's doing her best. Why can't you just forgive her?" Forgive her for what? For throwing my life into a dumpster because she wanted more space? For treating me like my only purpose was to absorb her messes? Every message only made my spine a little straighter. Then, late one Friday night, just as I was dozing off to the low rumble of traffic outside, I heard it. Pounding on my door. Sharp, frantic knocks. I sat up, heart racing. Another knock. Harder this time. I tiptoed to the peephole. It was Brianna. She looked terrible, hair tangled, mascara smeared, clutching a giant tote bag against her chest like a life raft. "Lisa," she hissed, voice shrill. "I know you're in there." I backed away from the door. My whole body was trembling, but not from fear. From anger. From exhaustion. From the sheer, overwhelming certainty that if I let her back into my life, I would lose everything I had clawed back for myself. She kept knocking, pleading. After 10 minutes, she sank down onto the welcome mat, sobbing loudly enough that a neighbor cracked open his door to peer out. I stood in the middle of my tiny apartment, frozen. The guilt throbbed in my chest like a second heartbeat. The old voice whispered, "You're supposed to fix this. You're the big sister. You're supposed to help." But another voice, quieter, steadier, whispered something else. "You owe her nothing." I wrapped myself in a blanket and slid down to the floor, sitting with my back against the door. I stayed like that for hours, listening to her cry, until eventually her sobs faded and I heard the shuffle of her footsteps retreating down the stairs. Only then did I allow myself to cry too, but my tears weren't just sadness. They were grief for the sister I had wanted, for the mother I had needed, for the family I had never really had. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But it was the truth. And sometimes, the truth was the only thing that could set you free. After that night, something between us, between all of us, shifted in a way that felt permanent. Brianna didn't show up at my door again. She didn't call or text. For a few days, I let myself hope that maybe it was finally over. Maybe she understood now that I wasn't coming back to play my old role, the fixer, the forgiver, the fool. But it wasn't over. It never really was with them. It started small. An invitation slipped under my door, a flyer for Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house, complete with a handwritten note from Mom, "Please be reasonable. Brianna is trying. It would mean a lot if you came." I stared at the paper for a long time before tossing it straight into the trash. A week later, a box arrived at the bakery downstairs, addressed to me. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a framed photo from when Brianna and I were kids, maybe 7 and 16, smiling stiffly in front of a Christmas tree. Tucked behind it was a note, "Family is forever, Lisa. You can't erase us." I returned the photo to the bakery owner and asked him to refuse any future deliveries. It was petty. It was manipulative. It was exactly the kind of emotional warfare my family specialized in. Still, the guilt gnawed at me some nights, especially when I lay awake and wondered if I was being too harsh. Was I the problem, like Mom always said? Was I really as cold and selfish as they insisted? But then I would remember standing in front of my empty closet. I would remember Brianna's flippant smile, Mom's angry voice on the phone. And I would breathe a little easier. Meanwhile, life outside of them quietly expanded. At pottery class, I made a friend, a woman named Jenna, a retired nurse who wore tie-dye scarves and had a loud, cackling laugh. She was the first person in years who didn't know my family, who didn't know me as the Whitmore girl. One night after class, we grabbed coffee at a little 24-hour diner. I found myself telling her more than I had told anyone in years, about Brianna, about my parents, about how exhausting it was to always be the one cleaning up other people's wreckage. Jenna stirred her coffee thoughtfully and said, "You know, sometimes love means staying. And sometimes it means walking away so you don't drown with them." Simple. Direct. No judgment. I almost cried right there in the booth. It was around that time that the rumors started. Apparently, Brianna was telling anyone who would listen that I had abandoned her, left her homeless, betrayed the family. I heard it through the grapevine, mostly through pitying looks and whispered conversations that would fall silent when I walked into a room. One afternoon, I bumped into Pastor Collins at the farmer's market. He pulled me aside, concern heavy on his weathered face. "I don't want to meddle," he said gently. "But your mother's been very vocal about her side of things. Maybe you should come by and clear the air?" Clear the air. As if a few words could undo years of being overlooked, blamed, used. I smiled politely, told him I'd think about it, and walked away without looking back. The real blow came a few days before Christmas. I received an official-looking letter in the mail. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was from a lawyer. Apparently, my parents were planning to reclaim the few heirloom items I had, namely, the side table that had belonged to my grandmother. They claimed it was family property and that I had no right to keep it. I laughed when I read it. An ugly, broken laugh that didn't sound like me at all. The table wasn't valuable in any real way. It was scratched and worn, hardly worth a few dollars. But to them, it wasn't about the table. It was about control. About pulling me back into their web by any means necessary. That night, I sat on the cold linoleum floor of my apartment, staring at the battered table, running my fingers over its worn edges. I thought about giving it back. About surrendering, just to make it all stop. But then I thought about everything else they had taken. My peace. My trust. My belief that I mattered just as much as Brianna did. No more. I called a lawyer the next morning, a woman named Ms. Patel, who specialized in family disputes. She was brisk, efficient, and didn't waste time with pity. "You're under no legal obligation to return anything, unless there's a written will or ownership documents. Which, judging by your story, they don't have." "No," I said, feeling a strange, fierce pride burn in my chest. "They don't." "Then you're fine," she said. "And if they keep harassing you, we can escalate." I thanked her and hung up, feeling lighter than I had in months. The next day, I boxed up the framed photo Brianna had sent, along with every note, every letter, every guilt trip they had lobbed at me. I mailed it all back to my parents' house with no return address. I didn't include a note. I didn't need to. They knew exactly what it meant. After sending that box back, something shifted deep inside me. I stopped looking over my shoulder. I stopped waiting for another knock at my door, another letter, another accusation. Instead, I leaned harder into my new life. Jenna and I grew closer. She invited me to a small potluck she hosted with a handful of friends, older women mostly, artists and retired teachers, and a retired firefighter named Donna who told the funniest stories I'd ever heard. It was the first time I had ever sat at a table and felt chosen. Not obligated. At first, I didn't know what to do with that feeling. It was so different from the constant tension of my family gatherings. No one here was waiting to explode, to blame, to guilt. They just wanted to share food, talk about books, laugh about nothing. Slowly, they became my people. My real family. Meanwhile, Brianna was unraveling, and this time, I wasn't there to catch her. Word got around. She bounced from couch to couch, burning bridges wherever she landed. Got fired from 2 different barista jobs. Lost an art commission because she missed every deadline. Mom kept calling people, begging them to take Brianna in, to help her get back on her feet. But sympathy was running thin. Turns out, when you destroy enough goodwill, even the enablers eventually run out of excuses for you. One Saturday morning, as I was walking home from pottery class with a new coffee mug I had actually made with my own 2 hands, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. It was my father. "Lisa," he said, voice rough. I wanted to talk. I froze on the sidewalk. In my entire life, my father had barely called me for anything that wasn't an obligation or a guilt trip. "I just wanted you to know," he continued awkwardly, "your mother's been telling everyone you abandoned the family. That you're selfish. But I've been thinking. Maybe we weren't very fair to you." I didn't say anything. I just listened, heart pounding. "I'm sorry," he said. Just 2 simple words, but they cracked something open inside me. Not enough to forgive. Not enough to go back. But enough to finally close the door with no regrets. "I appreciate you saying that," I said quietly. "But I'm done being the only one who shows up. I'm happy now. I hope you find your own way to be, too." There was a long pause. "I guess you're not coming home for Christmas, huh?" he said, almost like he already knew the answer. "No," I said, smiling softly. "I'm already home." I hung up before he could say anything else. And just like that, I felt lighter. Christmas came, and instead of sitting through tense family dinners where every bite was laced with resentment, I hosted my first real Christmas potluck in my tiny studio. Jenna came, bringing her famous cranberry tart. Donna brought homemade eggnog. Even Mr. Wallace, my old landlord, dropped by with a plate of gingerbread cookies. We laughed until our sides hurt. We swapped small, thoughtful gifts. At one point, Jenna raised her glass and said, "To found family. The ones who actually deserve a seat at your table." We all clinked glasses, and I thought, this was the life I had built. Not out of spite. Not out of bitterness. But out of survival. Out of choosing love that wasn't conditional. Out of finally choosing myself. Meanwhile, Brianna's life kept imploding. She tried to launch a GoFundMe to get back on her feet. It flopped spectacularly, barely a few dollars trickled in. People had seen too much. They knew the pattern now. And Mom? She kept throwing little pity parties in the church bulletin, writing vague prayer requests like for our daughter who has lost her way. But people started noticing the gaps in the stories. Started questioning why it was always someone else's fault. They stopped offering endless sympathy. The final blow came 6 months later. An art gallery downtown, one of the few prestigious ones in Charleston, hosted an exhibit titled "The Art of Starting Over." One of the featured artists was Jenna's friend Teresa. I went, partly to support her, partly just to enjoy an evening out. The place was packed, artists, collectors, gallery owners. And right there, on the main wall, was a painting. Not one of mine, I wasn't nearly that talented yet. But a painting Teresa had made, inspired by a conversation we had had over coffee. It was called "Empty Closets." It showed a woman standing in front of an empty closet, staring into the vast space, her face unreadable, not grief-stricken, not enraged, just free. Beneath it, a small plaque, dedicated to those who choose themselves, even when no one else does. I stood there for a long time, tears prickling behind my eyes. Not sadness this time. Pride. Freedom. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about knowing that they had no power over me. That was the most satisfying ending I could have ever asked for. Without screaming. Without begging. Without lowering myself. I had won. Because I had walked away, and built something beautiful where their chaos used to live. And I wasn't going back. Ever.